There is something almost no one tells you about narcissists, and it is the single most misunderstood truth in the entire landscape of narcissistic relationships. Most people believe that when a narcissist loses someone who genuinely loved them, they finally wake up, finally feel the weight of what they destroyed, finally understand the depth of the love they were given. But clinical reality tells a very different story. What actually happens inside the mind of a narcissist when they realize they lost someone real is not awakening in the way most survivors imagine. It is not remorse in the way healthy people experience remorse. It is something far more complex, far more revealing, and far more important for you to understand. Because misunderstanding this one moment is what keeps thousands of survivors emotionally trapped long after the relationship is already ended. Before we go deeper into this, I want to gently invite you to subscribe to this channel because what we do here is not entertainment, and it is not surface-level commentary. This space exists for people who have loved someone incapable of loving them back the way they deserved, for people who are trying to make sense of confusion that no one around them seems to understand, for people who are quietly rebuilding themselves after emotional manipulation, coercive control, and the slow erosion of their identity. Every video is created to help you recognize manipulation earlier, heal the parts of you that were wounded in silence, restore your sense of self, and finally reclaim the peace that was taken from you piece by piece. If that is the journey you are on, subscribing is a small act of self-alignment, a quiet way of saying that you are choosing clarity over confusion and understanding over self-blame. Now, let us step into the truth. To understand how a narcissist changes when they realize they lost someone who truly loved them, you first have to why they so rarely recognize that love while it is still in front of them. Narcissistic personality structures are built on a fragile internal foundation, one that is defended by grandiosity, entitlement, and a chronic need for external validation. Underneath that defensive architecture is often a deeply underdeveloped emotional self shaped by early attachment wounds, unmet developmental needs, and in many cases, unprocessed shame. Because their inner world is organized around protecting a fragile self-image, they tend to perceive relationships through the lens of utility rather than intimacy. They notice what a person provides, how a person makes them feel about themselves, how a person reflects their idealized identity back to them. What they struggle to perceive, sometimes almost entirely, is the quiet, steady, self-giving nature of genuine love. Genuine love does not flatter the ego. It does not perform. It does not chase. It simply stays, gives, and remains consistent. And to a psyche built on stimulation, admiration, and control, consistency can feel invisible. This is why so many survivors describe the same painful pattern. They gave everything, and it was treated as nothing. They were loyal, patient, forgiving, emotionally available, and yet somehow always accused of not doing enough. That is not because your love was insufficient. It is because the narcissistic mind is often incapable of metabolizing love that is not tied to admiration or control. Real love arrives too quietly for a nervous system addicted to intensity, and so it gets overlooked, minimized, taken for granted, and sometimes even resented until the moment it disappears. And that moment, the moment of loss, is where the psychological unraveling begins. But here is where survivors are so often misled. What looks like heartbreak in a narcissist is frequently not heartbreak in the traditional emotional sense. It is something clinicians often describe as narcissistic injury. When a narcissist realizes that someone who truly loved them is gone, they are not necessarily grieving the person. They are grieving the loss of a mirror, the loss of a stable source of emotional supply, the loss of control over a dynamic they believe they owned, and most painfully for their ego, the loss of the illusion that they were always the one in power. Losing admiration wounds the ego. Losing control wounds the sense of dominance. Losing supply wounds the internal regulation system they depend on. But losing someone who genuinely loved them wounds something deeper, because it forces them to confront a truth their defenses were built to avoid. The truth that they were loved in a way they did not know how to receive, and that this love is now unreachable. What happens next is often mistaken for transformation, and this is where so many survivors fall back into cycles that hurt them. When a narcissist recognizes that authentic emotional investment is not easily replaced, several psychological reactions can emerge, often in overlapping waves. There can be confusion because the internal narrative that they were always the more valuable partner begins to crack. There can be frustration because their usual strategies of charm, blame shifting, guilt induction, or intermittent affection no longer produce the reaction they used to. There can be shame, though often unconsciously experienced and quickly defended against, because shame is the very emotion their entire personality structure was built to avoid feeling. There can be panic because losing a stable emotional anchor can destabilize their sense of identity. And there can be rage, sometimes cold and calculated, sometimes explosive, because narcissistic injury is often expressed outward rather than processed inward. What almost never appears in this early phase is genuine empathy. Empathy requires the capacity to sit with another person's pain without centering oneself in it. It requires accountability without self-protection and reflection without defensiveness. These are capacities that develop through sustained emotional work, often over years, and they cannot suddenly appear because someone walked away. This is why in the aftermath of losing someone real, many narcissistic individuals do not soften. They escalate. Their attempts to regain control may intensify precisely because the loss has destabilized them. This is the phase where survivors often experience what is commonly called hoovering, a term used to describe the behaviors designed to pull a person back into the relational orbit. It can look like unexpected apologies that feel unusually articulate. It can look like grand gestures, sudden vulnerability, promises of therapy, or claims of profound realization. It can look like reappearing during moments they know you are emotionally vulnerable. It can even look like using mutual connections, shared responsibilities, or crises to reopen contact. And here is the psychological truth that survivors must hold on to with both hands. Regret is not the same as change. Regret is an emotional response to consequence. Change is a structural transformation of character. A narcissist can absolutely feel regret, sometimes intensely, because regret is largely about the self, about what one lost, about how one is now perceived, about the discomfort of an unfamiliar emotional state. But regret rooted in personal loss is not the same as remorse rooted in genuine understanding of the harm caused to another human being. One is self-referential, the other is other-oriented, and only the second one leads to sustainable change. This is why survivors so often describe the confusing experience of a narcissist appearing to change for a short period only to return to familiar patterns once access is regained. Temporary behavioral shifts are not uncommon after significant loss because the discomfort motivates surface-level adjustment, but genuine personal transformation is a different phenomenon entirely. It requires accountability without conditions, meaning the willingness to acknowledge harm even when there is nothing to gain. It requires long-term self-reflection, often uncomfortable, often destabilizing, often involving the very shame the personality was organized to avoid. It requires consistent therapeutic work, typically with a clinician trained in personality dynamics, and it requires the internal capacity to tolerate that work over years, not weeks. It requires emotional responsibility, meaning the willingness to hold one's own feelings without projecting them onto others. And it requires sustained effort that continues even when no one is watching, even when there is no relationship to save, even when there is no audience to perform for. This level of transformation is possible, but it is rare, and it cannot be measured by a single apology, a single conversation, or a single emotional moment. It can only be measured over time through pattern, through consistency, through behavior that no longer requires the survivor's presence to be maintained. I want to pause here because I know that this part of the journey can be especially painful. Many of you watching have been holding on to the hope that the person you loved will one day understand what they lost, that they will come back different, softer, healed, transformed. That hope is not weakness. It is the natural residue of real love. But I want you to know that healing does not depend on their transformation. And if this channel has been helping you see things more clearly, I want to invite you again to subscribe and stay with us because understanding narcissistic abuse is not a one-time revelation. It is a layered process of unlearning confusion, rebuilding self-trust, strengthening emotional resilience, and slowly returning to yourself. We walk that path together here, one insight at a time, and your presence in this community matters more than you may realize. Now, let us go into something that is rarely discussed with the depth it deserves. When a narcissist loses someone who truly loved them, they are often forced, sometimes for the first time in their adult life, to sit in the presence of their own emotional emptiness. Throughout their life, that emptiness has been managed through external means. Attention, admiration, conquest, control, novelty, status, drama, and cycles of idealization and devaluation all serve as regulators for an inner world that struggles to self-soothe. When someone who genuinely loved them leaves, and when that person does not return, the usual regulators begin to fail. New supply may feel thinner, less nourishing, harder to sustain. Superficial admiration no longer fills the space that real love used to occupy, even if that love was never fully received. And in that void, some narcissistic individuals experience what can only be described as a confrontation with their own interior. A confrontation their entire defensive system was designed to prevent. For some, this confrontation becomes the beginning of a very long, very difficult process of genuine self-examination. For most, however, it becomes another wound to defend against, another injury to externalize, another reason to seek new sources of validation. This is why survivors are often warned not to interpret a narcissist's suffering as evidence of growth. Suffering is not the same as insight. Pain is not the same as accountability. Loneliness is not the same as remorse. Many people can feel deeply broken and still cause deep harm. The presence of pain in someone who hurt you does not obligate you to return, and it does not mean they have become safe. And this brings us to what I believe is the most liberating truth in this entire conversation. Your healing was never supposed to depend on their transformation. For a long time, many survivors organize their inner world around a quiet question. Will they finally understand what they lost? Will they finally see me? Will they finally become the person I always believed they could be? These questions are understandable because they are the echoes of hope, love, and the emotional investment you gave. But as long as your peace is tied to their evolution, you remain emotionally tethered to someone who may never do the work required to meet you where you deserve to be met. True freedom begins when you stop measuring your worth by their capacity to recognize it. Because here is what is real. You do not need their apology to validate your pain. You do not need their acknowledgement to confirm your reality. You do not need their transformation to justify your decision to protect yourself. Your experiences were real when they were happening, and they remain real whether or not they are ever understood by the person who caused them. The most profound psychological shift a survivor can make is moving from seeking closure through the other person to creating closure through the self. Closure is not a conversation. It is a decision. It is the internal act of choosing to stop waiting, stop explaining, stop hoping, and start returning fully to your own life. And when make that shift, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to notice how much of your emotional energy was being spent monitoring, anticipating, decoding, and adjusting to someone else's inner world. You begin to reclaim the mental space that was once occupied by their moods, their unpredictability, their needs, their crises. You begin to hear your own thoughts again without the constant background noise of their influence. You begin to trust your perceptions, honor your instincts, and rebuild the parts of you that were quietly abandoned in order to keep the peace. You begin to understand that the confidence you lost was not lost because you were weak, but because you were being systematically destabilized. And as you rebuild, you develop something that no manipulator can ever take from you again, an internal compass grounded in self-respect rather than external approval. This is the psychological freedom that emerges when you stop seeking validation from someone incapable of healthy reciprocity. It is not a dramatic freedom. It is quiet. It is steady. It looks like sleeping through the night without replaying old conversations. It looks like no longer flinching at certain notifications. It looks like being able to hear their name without your nervous system collapsing. It looks like feeling neutrality where there used to be longing. It looks like meeting new people from a place of wholeness rather than hunger. It looks like being able to love again without abandoning yourself in the process. And it looks like recognizing manipulation early, calmly, and without self-doubt because you now understand the patterns that once confused you. So, when you find yourself wondering whether they have changed, Gently redirect that question inward. Ask instead how much you have changed. Ask how much stronger your boundaries have become. Ask how much more clearly you now see. Ask how much more deeply you now trust yourself, because that is where the real transformation of this entire experience lives. Not in them, but in you. And if they ever do genuinely change, that change will not require your presence to be verified. It will not need to be performed for you. It will not arrive through dramatic gestures or emotionally charged reappearances. It will show itself, if it ever does, through years of consistent, unglamorous, unwitnessed effort that has nothing to do with winning you back and everything to do with becoming a different person. Until then, and even beyond then, your work is your own. Your peace is your own. Your becoming is your own. And no one, no matter how deeply they were once woven into your story, has the right to hold the pen of your future. If this conversation reached something inside you today, if it named something you have been carrying quietly for a long time, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who may need to hear these words tonight, and leave a comment about what resonated most. Because your voice becomes part of the healing of others who are still finding their way. Every video here is created with one intention: to help you understand narcissistic behavior with clinical clarity, rebuild your confidence from the inside out, and create the kind of relationships with others and with yourself that reflect the love you were always worthy of.